All right, let's get right into it. For, decades, the story of American energy was pretty simple: decline and dependence. But then, almost out of nowhere, everything just flipped. We're going to unpack the absolutely wild story of how the U.S. went from being at the mercy of foreign oil to becoming the undisputed #1 producer on the entire planet. To really get this incredible comeback, you have to understand just how bad the crisis was. So, picture this. It's 1973. The president, Richard Nixon, is on TV telling Americans they need to carpool, take the bus, and he's slapping a national speed limit of 55 miles an hour on everyone. Now, this wasn't some new green initiative. This was a full-blown emergency. A superpower was on its knees simply because it couldn't get its hands on enough oil from other countries. In that moment, right there, it kicked off a whole new era. An era defined by one single feeling: vulnerability. The entire American way of life, the one built on cheap, endless energy, suddenly looked like it was built on a house of cards. The country basically swore, never again. What's so fascinating about this timeline is that it shows a scary prediction basically coming true. See, way back in the 50s, some experts warned we'd hit peak oil around 1970. And guess what? They were spot on. Production peaked, and then it just started this long, slow, painful slide downwards. Nixon's big plan, Project Independence, was supposed to fix all that. He promised we'd be self-sufficient by 1980. But fast forward to 2008, and our production had hit rock bottom. Yeah, so that's the key thing to realize. All the political promises, all the big talk, it was totally disconnected from what was actually happening on the ground. Instead of becoming independent, America's addiction to foreign oil just got worse. In fact, imports literally doubled within just a few years of Nixon's announcement. The decline just seemed completely irreversible. And then, something that nobody thought was possible happened. A reversal so huge, so unexpected, it blew every single prediction out of the water and completely reshaped the global map of energy. The scale of this comeback is just staggering. This graph says it all. You can see the peak back in 1970, about 11 million barrels a day. Then, for nearly 40 years, it's just a nosedive, all the way down to 7 million by 2008. But then, look at that, an absolute explosion. In just a decade, not only was the entire 40-year decline erased, but production rocketed past the old record to over 12 million barrels a day. It's a comeback story like no other. And the results of this were just massive. America didn't just get back on its feet, it became totally dominant. It blew right past Russia and Saudi Arabia to become #1. We started exporting more oil than we imported. And get this, a single oil field down in Texas now pumps out more oil than almost any other entire country in the world. So that brings us to the big question, right? The whole reason we're doing this explainer. What happened? How on earth did a country that had seemingly tapped out all its cheap, easy oil suddenly find more than it ever had before? Well, the answer wasn't luck. It was a technological revolution. See, this wasn't about discovering some giant, new underground lake of oil that we'd missed. No, this was about figuring out how to get to oil that we always knew was there, we just couldn't get it out of the ground cheaply enough. This is the story of the shale revolution. Okay, so to get this revolution, you first need to know there are basically two kinds of oil. For 100 years, everyone chased conventional oil. That's the easy stuff. It collects in big pools, and all you have to do is drill a straw down into it and slurp it up. But by the 2000s, that was pretty much all gone. What was left was shale oil, and it's trapped inside billions of tiny pores in super dense rock. Getting that out, that's a whole different ballgame. And the solution was a technology called hydraulic fracturing, or what we all call fracking. It basically works in 3 main steps. First, instead of just drilling straight down, they figured out how to turn the drill bit sideways and steer it for miles through these super thin layers of shale rock. Then they pump a high-pressure mix of water and sand down there to literally crack the rock open. And finally, the grains of sand prop those tiny cracks open, which lets the oil that was trapped inside finally flow out. Now, here is the real kicker. The huge companies, your Exxons, your Chevrons, they thought this whole thing was a waste of time and money. They were off chasing giant, easy oil fields in other countries. So, with the big dogs out of the picture, the American heartland was left to these wildcatters, these small, scrappy, independent drillers who are willing to roll the dice, experiment, and slowly perfect these really difficult new techniques. That underdog story is great, but it does make you wonder, why did this only happen in America? Why not China or Argentina? Well, it turns out the US was sitting in this kind of Goldilocks zone, a perfect storm of unique conditions that just couldn't be found anywhere else. It was a uniquely American formula. First, you had the geology, a massive ancient seabed left behind these perfect, oil-rich layers of shale rock right down the center of the country. Second, the geography. These places are mostly empty, far from big cities, but not so remote you can't build roads and infrastructure. Then you add in all the pipelines left over from the last oil boom and, believe it or not, decades of political support from both parties. It was a recipe that just couldn't be replicated anywhere else on Earth. And the timing of all this, it was just unbelievable. The shale boom went into overdrive right in 2008, just as the global economy was completely melting down. While other industries were bleeding jobs, shale created about 1 million of them, which helped offset huge losses in places like manufacturing. At one point, fracking was responsible for something like 40% of all of America's GDP growth. It was, no exaggeration, an economic lifeline. So it's this incredible story, right? Innovation, economic rescue, global power. But there's a secret. A massive $300 billion secret that completely changes how we should think about this entire revolution. Between 2011 and 2020, the entire U.S. shale industry, despite breaking all those production records, lost a cumulative $300 billion. I'm going to say that again. They lost $300 billion. They were literally setting more money on fire than almost any industry in modern history. To put that number into perspective, let's think about a company like WeWork, the poster child for burning through cash. In its absolute worst years, it lost around $15 billion. The shale industry lost 20 times that amount. This wasn't a profitable business. It was a money-shredding machine that was being kept alive by mountains and mountains of debt. So here's the most important takeaway. The shale revolution wasn't really a business in the traditional sense. You could almost think of it as a massive, debt-fueled subsidy for the entire country. That $300 billion in investor losses, that's what paid for our cheap gas, for our energy-hungry economy, and for our new freedom from being blackmailed by foreign oil powers. We all got a piece of the benefit, whether we realized it or not. And all of this leaves us with a pretty big and, honestly, a pretty unsettling question. America became an energy superpower, sure, but it did it on a mountain of borrowed money and borrowed time. The investors who funded those losses are finally demanding to be paid back. So what happens to America's power? What happens to our lifestyles when that $300 billion subsidy finally dries up? What happens when the bill for this whole party finally comes due?